Hello, how are you? My name is Wendy Eisen.
Wendy, you've been a long-time activist in the struggle for Soviet Jewry. How did all of this activism become the book, Countess In?
Well, my activism started in the 1970s when I was one of the founding members of the Montreal Group of 35, Women's Campaign for Soviet Jewry. And the 35s were an international organization made up of women from all over the world, who, except basically the United States, but there were 4 different cities in Canada that had the 35s, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Winnipeg. So my activity with Soviet Jewry grew in 1989 when the campaign to free Jews from the Soviet Union was almost over and the gates opened. It was time to reflect and see exactly what we had achieved. And what we had achieved was a miraculous victory.
Your book, though, begins much before 1984. It actually has a history of the Soviet Jews.
The book begins, really, the book is the struggle to free Soviet Jews as a Canadian perspective. And it begins in the 50s with the first trip to the Soviet Union by a Jew who came back and declared himself supportive of Soviet Jewry. In fact, it was a Jewish man who was a member of the Communist Party.
Joseph Salzburg.
Yes, J.B. Salzburg. And he was always active in Canadian Jewish Congress as well. But he declared himself supportive of Soviet Jewry after meeting with Khrushchev, and renounced his membership in the Communist Party in 1956.
And how did you first get involved?
In 1974, how did I first get involved? I heard Shaliach speak about, he was a man from New York who was an emissary on behalf of Soviet Jewry working with the Israeli consulate. And in his speech he said, somewhere on a plane between Vienna and Lod Airport is the future Prime Minister of the State of Israel. And when I heard that, I thought to myself, is this the caliber of person who we are saving? And recognized that this was a role that I had to become involved in.
I remember the group of 35 being very, very active in Montreal, and they seemed to get into the news a lot. Could you refresh our listeners as to what they were doing?
The goal of the 35s was to promote the plight of Soviet Jewry. And the main purpose every time we had a demonstration was to get on the front pages of the newspaper, because the more people who knew about it and the more news that we received, the more sensitive the Soviets were to all this publicity. And we demonstrated, we adopted families, we had marches, we organized Simchat Torah rallies, and we did a lot of what was considered at that time outrageous behavior for middle-class Jewish women.
And also, at the time, there was quiet diplomacy going on, too, I believe.
There was always quiet diplomacy going on behind the scenes. Truthfully, the original mandate of Canadian Jewish Congress was quiet diplomacy. They were acting on the advice of the World Jewish Congress, and they felt that if they demonstrated openly that it would jeopardize the situation for the Jews in the Soviet Union. In fact, it was discovered that that had the opposite effect, because the more overt we were and the louder we were, the faster our voices were heard.
I seem to remember that at first the group of 35 was receiving flack from the local Jewish communities for being so openly active.
Well, in the 60s, demonstrations were organized by students on college campuses. And there was a tremendous amount of what erupted very often was violence, so it wasn't deemed to be the most appropriate way for Jewish mothers, wives and mothers, to express themselves.
And over the years, the work that was being done from here was being expanded and expanded, going into many different directions.
What happened was our National Congress Committee had representation from all other Jewish organizations, and we had tremendous support from Hadassah. The Congress Committee started out in the 70s as a tripartite organization with B'nai B'rith and CZF, Canadian Zionist Federation, with Congress being responsible for the funding. After a few years, it clearly became a Congress committee, and the other committees sat on on it as representative organizations.
At this time also the students were getting more and more active in doing all sorts of imaginative actions.
The students, truthfully, came even before the 35s. The student struggle for Soviet Jewry was born in New York in 1964, and it was in the late 60s when Erwin Kotler was a student at McGill University that they held their first demonstration. I think it was 1965. They had their first conference and a meeting where the student activists came up from New York, and of course the students were always extremely supportive, and the 35s worked hand in hand with the students. So the 35s really were second to the students.
There was also the period, I remember, of the prisoners of consciousness.
Oh yes, there were anywhere from 20 to 40 Jewish prisoners of conscience at any one time. The ones that really put Soviet Jewry on the map were the Leningrad trial prisoners who were arrested in 1970 after the alleged hijack attempt failed. And it was the prisoners for whom we were always extremely concerned, because their living conditions, of course, were much worse than those of the refuseniks.
Are all of these prisoners, I believe, except one, are in Israel now?
All of the prisoners are in Israel now. I don't know of one who isn't.
I'd like to know a bit more about the book. It's called Countess in the Struggle for Soviet Jewry, and it's by you, Wendy Eisen. And is the book actually a history of the Soviet Jewry movement as orchestrated from Canada?
Yes, Countess in traces Soviet Jewry advocacy from the first trip to the Soviet Union by J.B. Salzberg in 1956 until the doors open wide to what we call Operation Exodus in 1989.